Okay, so we're going to take a short look at some of the other Asian countries, which we really haven't spent a large amount of time covering this semester. And part of that is the huge influence that China has on Japan and these other states. So, recall from earlier semester, we spent some time on China, and now we're back. We just covered China a little bit. We saw the changes of the dynasties and the role the Mongol invasions had. So now we're going to be looking at these other places and see what happens there. Well, with Japan, the big shift is this period known as the Heian period. This goes on from 794 to 1185 AD. And this is pretty much ultra elite family that's running the country, very secluded. And this family is called the Fujiwara clan, and it is stationed in Kyoto, where this famous temple is at. So one of the things again that comes over with China is Confucianism and Buddhism, and it sort of blends with the Japanese religion of Shintoism. So there's a little helpful video here if you want to check out more on Shintoism. Just go to your Prezi slides. It won't be on your test, so it's not something you have to squeeze in if you're hurting for time. Anyways, the Heian period is known as this big cultural moment in Japanese history. This is a history focused on the elites because the culture is being produced among the elites. What is, I think, shocking for us looking backwards at this time period is the fact that his most famous characters from it are women, like Lady Murasaki, and what some many historians consider the first true modern novel in history. And then Shei Shonagon, who was a contemporary, also part of like court life, and she wrote much more engaged, kind of like almost diaries, called the Pillow Book. So if you're thinking big global history and you're looking at the world and any kind of voice of women in history, this is obviously just big, there's a big difference. And again, we're talking about elites who are writing. These women had opportunities that most women in the world did not have. But it is kind of culturally significant that when we look at this time period, um, women are definitely play a major role as cultural makers. Okay, so the Han period crumbles, and you have the Kamakura period begin, and this leads to the creation of the shogunates. So, if you're thinking about this era of like samurais and what Japan's going to kind of be identified with for the next number of centuries, is this shogunate period where you set up basically like these warlords that are ruling. The first is Minamoto Yoritomo, and this also corresponds with the rise of various schools of Buddhism, including Pure Land Buddhism, which I find fascinating. The guy studied a Swiss theologian in the 20th century. Actually, didn't really veer off into other religions, but he was interested in looking at Buddhist Buddhism, at least Pure Land Buddhism, and the theology of the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. So it's just that's why when I see this, it always pops up in my head because it was a rarity. I'm seeing kind of stuff in his writings. Um, another eventually there was an attempt to end the shogunate system, uh, just for a couple of years, and then but that eventually fell, and this is known as the Kenmu Restoration. All that does was transition to the Muromachi period, and as you can see, this lasts by the time period we're out of this course. So that's medieval Japan. So let's take a look at some other countries just briefly. So same story kind of goes with we're talking about the rest of Asia, um, and we'll look at just Korea and Vietnam real quick. Um, Korea is known for having this kind of warring states period, where you have these three kingdoms. They're kind of at each other for a while, and it kind of goes back and forth until finally the Chilla, with the help of the Chinese. In fact, if you look at this, if you're doing reading a textbook, um, or just to know the general history of Korea or Vietnam area, you know that China had tried to, well, not try, but at various times conquers um, Korea, conquers Vietnam, or at least has a very big sphere of influence over it, over these areas. And at times, honestly, big moments of the history is when independence is achieved. But even when the Chilla kind of come out of the Three Kingdoms period, they're helped there by the Chinese. And then later, when they're defeated and their control is challenged, it's also pushed back against the Chinese. So real unification is usually attributed around 935, when they are unified under the Koryo, which kind of is where you get the name Korea from. Same thing with Vietnam. If you go through the history, see it's off back and forth. China is inserting its influence or starting its influence. A big moment, in Vietnamese history is when Ngo Nguyen um, defeats China at the Battle of Bac Dong in 938 AD. So I did mention the Mongols just a second ago, and I think this is fascinating. So as you saw on the map, we talked about for about a week ago. Mongols had basically just conquered almost everybody. It seemed, if you look at that map, um, Korea included in 1231. What's fascinating is how the Mongols were unable. I forgot to mention this from the last slide. Unable to conquer Japan. They were defeated by basically a hurricane of sorts. So they never could invade Japan. And same thing with Vietnam. They were not able to take Vietnam. And so by 1258, they had the Mongols gave up. Once you get to after the kind of following the Mongol period, you get the Chosun dynasty forming in Korea, and this is most famous leader is Sejong the Great, and so it's under his rule. I think it's where the alphabet really comes into being, and it's considered like the golden age of Korea. Okay. This last slide just kind of looks ahead. I'm not going to say much about it because it is um, more of kind of wrapping things up. I'm not really going to test you so much on it if you're in my typical Rules of One class. But it just you can kind of read through it. I think the big things, if you look at the map here, big things to just kind of take a look at what the world looked like on the eve of like Columbus's journey, the eve of the Reformation, um, stuff like that. And what you can see is, again, China had basically recovered, become this great dynasty again, the Ming Dynasty. The Timur invasions are kind of like like a repetition of the Mongol invasions from earlier. In fact, he had a lineage to Mongolians, and he is considered kind of a butcher when these figures in history. Um, and he's going to put some direct influence on India. And so within a generation or so, India is going to turn into the Mughal Empire, which is a Muslim run empire. And so they're going to wield a lot of influence here. And you kind of say that India kind of avoided a lot of direct Mongolian influence from the earlier invasions, but with Timur, he has more direct influence and changed a lot. Um, in the closer to the west, you're moving towards Europe. The Ottoman Empire is established with the fall of. The Ottoman Empire was already being established. I usually open up World Civ 2 talking about this, but just to say that um, the big point is that the Eastern Roman Empire, remember Byzantium and Emperor Constantine establishing Constantinople, way back earlier with Rome. This is now fallen apart, and now the Turks, Ottoman Turks, run this area, and they are threatening the borders of Western Europe. In fact, they're going to advance further in. So in closing, if this is what the world is looking like, and you got the whole Marco Polo story from about 100 years earlier, during Kublai Khan's reign. This is what leads Europeans over here to say, like, you know what, this is very dangerous territory to try to like navigate through. This is what pushes Europeans to start taking boats around the coast of Africa, essentially starting the slave trade, but also eventually by the end of the 15th century, they will start to settle here in the Indian Ocean, start trade, and that's where modern history begins.